Hey, good evening, A-Pushers. Welcome to this review of A-Push period 3 and 4. My name is Mr. Lagerway. I'm coming to you live from West Michigan, where we had some snow today, despite the fact that it's, halfway through April, and we're getting closer and closer to those May exams. Hope you folks are doing all right during this time period. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you're staying safe and sane out there. All right, so let's dive right in. Okay. So let's keep going. So what are we doing? Well, I want to make sure that we get the idea of the modified DBQ rubric. Some of you may have heard about this already. Some of you haven't. Hopefully your teachers are all up on you talking about all this kind of stuff and sending this to you in a variety of ways. But just in case you're not familiar with this, we're going to go over that, answer some of your questions about that. Then we got Unit 3 and 4 content, practice questions along the way, and then also questions along as we go. So let's dive right in. A reminder. Okay, so let's dive into some of the content we're talking about this evening. So Unit 3, remember, goes from 1754 to 1800. You should know those dates. At a minimum, you should be able to know the dates of the periods, right? And Peter was saying, yeah, we have made forums in the Fiveable community for review materials and one for peer editing DBQs. There's a one for Quizlets and stuff like that. Fantastic, yeah. Peter, if you could send a link to the community boards for APUSH at Fiveable, that'd be fantastic. Just throw that in the chat at some point because, yeah, I think it's community.fiveable.me, and then you can search it by subject and stuff like that. But I'll have a link at the end of the presentation as well. So Unit 3 goes from 1754 to 1800. 1754 is the beginning of the 7 Years' War. 1800 is the election of Thomas Jefferson, or the end of the early Republic era, the end of the Federalist presidency, end of Adams's presidency, the Revolution of 1800, etc. And so it's, well, basically, here are the three big things. The Revolutionary War, before, during, and after, the new government and how that works, and then also migration and trade and how that is constantly a problem for the United States, or at least it's constantly a source of conflict and something they need to try to deal with during this time. So that's Unit 3 in a quick overview. Let's dive a little bit deeper, shall we? So the road to revolution. You should be aware of things like the 7 Years' War, right? This is the one that involves kicking out the French. This is the one that involves the changes shown in the map there to the right, where you have France getting kicked out of the blue area. Then you have 1763. That's the start. Well, eventually in 1765 with the Stamp Act, you have direct taxation, the end of salutary neglect. Remember, 1763 is a very crucial year, right? It's the proclamation line of 1763. It's the end of the 7 Years' War. It's the end of salutary neglect, and it's Pontiac's Rebellion. A lot of stuff happening during this time period. So the British go, hey, that was expensive. We saved your colonial behinds. How about you cough up the money to pay for it? And we say, how about no, because we don't have any representation to go with that taxation, so we're out. And thus you get the road to the revolution. There's a lot of acts that you could potentially know, right? Feel free to know some of those, right? Lexington conquered, sure. The Daughters and the Sons of Revolution, sure. Smuggling, protests, boycotts, all of those things that are happening, yes, good idea. Don't forget the ladies are involved, right? Making homespun, etc. The First Great Awakening is in the background here, talking about how if I don't need to listen to a pope or a bishop or a really learned sort of pastor of some sort, then of course you don't have to listen to a king either. Hey, Tigist, good to see you again. Glad you got done with psych and you're coming back. Yeah, Agatha, Boston Massacre totally works during this time period. A lot of stuff happening here, right? The Enlightenment is happening. So the whole idea of separation of powers, the idea of consent of the governed, stuff like that, right? Social contract theory, John Locke, Montesquieu, all of those good things. So all of that combines to make the road to revolution a big deal. I would know that. So if you need to know a little bit more, do a deeper dive. We have some, Republican motherhood is going to be on a little bit later. I would say that's going to be after the Revolutionary War. There's certainly a lot of women getting involved here, but that's going to be more after the Revolutionary War. Could you use what as contextualization? Agatha, I'm not sure what you're referencing. Are you talking about Republican motherhood again or something else? Because, 7 Years' War. Yeah, no, the 7 Years' War is included in period 3, so it could be on the exam. And if you have something about the revolution, yes, please use the 7 Years' War as your contextualization. Great way to set it up because that's what's happening immediately before. It directly impacts it. I love it. You can draw a direct causation line. Yeah. Tigist, difference between the First and Second Great Awakening. First one happens in the 1730s, 40s, 50s-ish. The second one happens in the early 1800s, 1820s, 30s, 40s. or so. It even goes back a little bit farther, I suppose. First Great Awakening is all about the new lights, the old lights. They're both about a little bit more emotion rather than head knowledge, but the first one is more about individualism, so I connect it to the revolution. Second one is a whole lot more about holiness and making yourself better and therefore making society better, so I connect it with antebellum reform movements. So you don't have to dive in. This is not like a religious history class, right? We don't need to be like, well, the Methodists and the Baptists and all those things. But yeah, just know that there's new Protestant sects, denominations coming out of this thing, right? And the first one's tied to the revolution. Second one's tied to antebellum reform movements. There you go. Mafuz was asking, Tegas, the first one's basically caused because of the Enlightenment. Yeah, it's a little bit of a reaction to it and a little bit of a response to it. Yep. Mafuz was asking, is it true that many of the ideas in the Articles of Confederation tied back to Enlightenment principles? Absolutely. Yeah. Consent to the governed, democracy, separation of powers, the fact that it doesn't just have a king. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The Constitution, even more so. Yeah. Okay, so the American Revolution itself, well, you need to know why the United States wins. That's a variety of things, right? So there's the Loyalists, who certainly don't help, by John Adams's approximation, and we don't know this to be true, but it's a handy rule of thumb. He says about a third were Loyalists, about a third were Patriots, and about a third were just like, I don't care, leave me alone, don't burn my house down. And so the Loyalists did exist. You should be aware of them. Farmer refuted, et cetera, et cetera. You should be aware that the United States wins because of militias and the Continental Army. The militias are somewhat ineffective, especially if you consider them against the Continental Army, but they were both going to be using their guns that they had and the training, and led by George Washington, of course. The Articles of Confederation keep everybody together, and then they have the big turning point battles of Saratoga and Yorktown, et cetera. Be aware that women play a role, right? So Mary Hayes, Deborah Sampson, Molly Pitcher, but Mary Hayes is also known as Molly Pitcher, right? Women help out. They do homespun. They do boycotts against the British. They help out a whole lot. And then, of course, the French help the United States out a lot with guns and ships and things like that. And then there's a whole bunch of effects of this too, like abolitionism. People go, hey, we should be free from Britain. How about the slaves be free? And that happens more in the North than in the South. There's revolutions that get inspired by the American Revolution, like the Haitian, the French, the Latin American revolutions. And then, of course, Republican motherhood, as some people mentioned earlier. Republican motherhood has women saying, hey, men saying to women, hey, women, stay at home and take care of the next generation of good citizens. So raise up good boys who can be good voting citizens, and you can help make them, good people. And then also raise up good women who can marry good boys, marry good men, and then raise good boys, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How did the U.S. get an official military after the Revolution? Did we just reuse Revolutionary War soldiers, or did we draft people? Great question. We did not have an official draft. It was an all-volunteer army at first, right? So we did have some commissioned officers, some official people who were in the army, but we didn't have an active draft happening. And so, by the way, you're gonna constantly see this in American history. The United States has a constant draft occurring after World War II through Vietnam, but that's the only time period, and that's in period 8, and we don't even care about that. The United States constantly wants a small standing army. Remember the Quartering Act with the British, how they were stationing troops everywhere in the American colonies, and we didn't like that? We were trying to avoid that. And so we kept a very small standing army. And then we would go, oh no, War of 1812, build up the army. Okay, get rid of it and make it really small because we don't want to have tyranny. Okay, well, what about the Mexican War? And then we keep doing this, right? Exactly. Strong PTSD from England. We don't want a standing army because we associate that with England and tyranny and the king and the revolution, and we do not want that, which is even more remarkable because, of course, George Washington is a general. Yeah. So we get ourselves, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, the draft is used in 1969. It goes into the 1970s. I mean, yeah, wait, are you talking about a peacetime draft? Because there's been other war drafts as well. I'm confused as to what that exactly means. Because we had our first peacetime draft during before World War II, before Pearl Harbor, but then we also had drafts in the Civil War, both North and South, and then drafts during World War I and World War II. So that's a little bit confusing too. Either way, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Sorry. Reagan was asking, can we go into detail about the First Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention? Yes. So keep in mind, those are very different things. The First Continental Congress is very, very early. So that's in the 1770s. That's talking about 1760s even, talking about the responses to the Stamp Act, responses to the other acts. It's the one that launches well, it starts to get the states talking together before the Revolution. The Second Continental Congress, that's the one that meets a little bit later. That's the one that issues the Olive Branch Petition, if I remember correctly, the Declaration of Independence. It establishes the Articles of Confederation and continues to govern the colonies throughout the Revolution until it's replaced by the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention happens in 1787. That's 4 years after the American Revolution ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And that's going to involve a whole bunch of states coming together again. And they're supposed to revise their Articles of Confederation. They end up coming up with a whole new set of governing document called the Constitution. We'll talk about that in just a second. Yeah, Tegas, don't quote me on that. I'm feeling a little hazy on that for some reason right now. I'm pretty sure Declaration of Independence is Second Continental Congress. Olive Branch Petition, I'm pretty sure that's from them too, because that would have happened just before. But feel free to double check me on that and get back to us about it. So speaking of the Constitution, so after the United States gets to become its own independent country, they quickly realize, hey, we need a stronger central government. Shays Rebellion, right? Other things like that demonstrate the fact that we need to be able to hang together. There's the Annapolis Convention where trade is getting kind of funky. Caroline, you confirmed Olive Branch Petition and Declaration of Independence are both Second Continental Congress. Awesome. All right. Fairly detailed. I suspect you won't need to know it in that much detail, but I'm glad you folks know that. Fantastic. Thanks for double checking me. The Constitution, and you should know the convention and the compromises that happen, right? So Shays Rebellion and Annapolis Convention are some of the things that make us go, oh, we need a stronger central government. But then there's a whole bunch of compromises that happen here. 3/5 Compromise, the Great Compromise, we're not going to touch the importation of slaves for a good 20 years compromise. You have the location of the nation's capital compromise eventually, right? There's a whole bunch of compromises that happen here. Most notorious, of course, being the 3/5 Compromise, and then the most famous and not notorious would be the Great Compromise. So the fact that we have a bicameral legislature. So you should know some of those compromises that occur in the Constitutional Convention, Fugitive Slave Act, for example, stuff like that. And then ratification debates. So the Constitution is a little bit controversial, to put it mildly. By the way, this is where you want to talk about anti-federalists, right? So if you're talking about anti-federalists, you have to be talking about the constitutional ratification. Anti-federalists are a one-issue, not even party, faction. And if they're not talking about the ratification of the Constitution, they don't exist, right? So this happens because the Bill of Rights gets passed, right? Nice job, Tegas. Bill of Rights. This is where we get the Federalist Papers written by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison. So the cartoon at the bottom there is one of those famous ratification cartoons. As each state ratifies, it becomes a new pillar in the national government. Yes, Fady, let me just be very clear here. There is a fugitive slave part of the Constitution that says anybody held to service in one area should be returned to the other state. However, it was not very strong and it was not followed very well. So you're probably getting confused because there is a much stronger additional Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850 as part of the Compromise of 1850, right? So that's kind of confusing. You're like, wait a minute, isn't there already one? Why do we need another one? Partly because it wasn't being enforced very well and it wasn't super strong. Great question. I'm sure other people had that too and we're getting kind of confused. Sorry about that. So yes, there is a fugitive slave part of the Constitution, Fugitive Slave Clause. Usually referred to as the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, and the Fugitive Slave Act is in the 1850s. That might be a handy distinction for you, in case that helps. So the early republic, it has some migration stuff that you should be aware of, like this guy, Little Turtle. The United States has to continue to deal with Native Americans when we're stealing their land out west. And so we need to be aware of things like the Treaty of Grenville, Battle of Fallen Timbers, things like that, just some examples. Jay's Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty. The United States continues to negotiate with other countries. Jay's Treaty, remember, is supposed to deal with British impressment, doesn't really, but gets the British to leave their forts in the Midwest along the Great Lakes. And everybody hates Jay because they think he gave up too much. And this kind of shows Washington's pro-Great Britain bias, at least as far as Jefferson is concerned. Pinckney's Treaty is the one that gives the United States the right to go down the Mississippi and go through the port of New Orleans. And then that's handy for trade that happens on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains. And then the Whiskey Rebellion, remember this, along with Hamilton's financial plan that we'll talk about a little bit, but this just shows that backcountry people are continuing to be a problem for the United States, Like, what do you do with farmers who want to be able to ship their grain as whiskey across the mountains, etc.? And then cotton gin and slavery. People continue to move west over the Appalachian Mountains. And the cotton gin, invented in 1793, means that slavery is incredibly lucrative, especially cotton growing, and that's going to continue to move. And then lastly, one of those forgotten things is that, keep in mind, the Spanish are still in the American Southwest. Junipero Serra, and he's a leader, he's a monk right there, as you can see, and he's leading a bunch of Catholic Spanish missions all up and down the coast of California, San Francisco, etc. So the Spanish continue to have that presence in southwestern United States. Remember, the oldest American state capital is going to be Santa Fe, New Mexico, right? So the Spanish are there for a long time. I'm actually in the middle of reading a fantastic book that's talking about that. Yeah, it does kind of look like big brain time, doesn't it? I'm reading this great book right now called Our America, Hispanic History of the United States by Felipe Fernandez Armesto. And he talks about, yeah, we need to start American history from the Southwest and from Florida and from Santa Fe and New Mexico and places like that. Great book. Sorry, I just love recommending books, ask my students. But that's a great quarantine book for me right now. All right. Last but not least, we have the early republic government and culture. So this guy right here, you all should recognize him. Here comes the general. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for. The pride of Mount Vernon, George Washington. He is our first president. Nice job. Not going to wrap this time. Sorry, that's only for the cram pass people. But Washington is the nation's first president. He's president for 2 terms. And there's a couple things you should be aware of with him. Know the Hamilton-Jefferson stuff, right? So know the conflict over the first bank, over the whiskey tax, over the creation of a stronger central government, Hamilton's financial plan, federal assumption of states' debts, et cetera, et cetera. Basically listen to Hamilton, right? And then you start to get Washington's cabinet splitting into the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, Federalists being led by Hamilton and John Adams, Democratic Republicans being led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Keep in mind, James Madison, a Federalist when it comes to ratification, not a Federalist when it comes to actual governing. That's a little bit confusing. Make sure you get that. And then, of course, George Washington is going to announce things like the Neutrality Act in the midst of the conflict between between the French and the British. And so he kind of takes sides there. But his farewell address argues for neutrality. John Adams, his successor, is going to run into these problems. So he's president next. He's only president for 1 term. And he's going to be dealing with this quasi-war with France. Partly because he's a Federalist, he kind of tends to side with Great Britain. Not that he wants to be taken over by Great Britain, but that he wants to be able to be like them with their elitism, their trade, their mercantilism. He wants to be like them. And we end up having problems, even though the British are attacking us too. The French attack us, and we kind of attack back. This is the XYZ affair, Citizen Genet, stuff like that. And he ends up passing the Alien and Sedition Acts along with Congress, and those are very unpopular, and they're one of the reasons why he loses to Jefferson in 1800. You should be aware of things like the Midnight Judges, John Marshall, right? He appoints John Marshall, a Federalist judge, who is then on the bench for a very long time. Yes, Tegus, the Alien and Sedition Acts do have a sense of state nullification thanks to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Nice job. Yes, secretly written by Madison and Jefferson to be able to say the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional. George Washington won 100% of the popular vote, but only 69 electoral votes. Yeah, it's true, because those are the only ones he needed, right? Nice. And then also be a little bit aware of national culture. The fact that during this time, a lot of people are starting to say, okay, what's this new republic going to be like? The United States kind of has this whole, we want to be like the Greeks and the Romans. And so Monticello, which is pictured there, is kind of modeled after Greek. It looks like the Parthenon, or the Pantheon, excuse me, in Rome. And so this neoclassical architecture becomes everywhere. If you've visited Washington, D.C., or even seen pictures, you know that like Roman style and Greek style columns are everywhere. And so that's part of the national culture that emerges during this time period, just so you're aware. Period 3 is very helpful if you're going to be talking about, if you study Hamilton, that's very helpful with period 3. Cindy, can I explain judicial review? That's actually a part of period 4, so we'll get there. Yeah, from Marbury v. Madison. Marbury v. Madison. That's going to be in 1803, I believe, same year as the Louisiana Purchase. We'll get to that in just a second. But yes, it's definitely John Marshall. And Dana was talking about Jay's and Pinckney's treaty. Yeah. So again, Jay's treaty is made with the British, and it gets the British to leave their forts in the Midwest. It's like a second Treaty of Paris. It cleans up the problems after the American Revolution, but it does not deal with British impressment of U.S. sailors, so everybody gets mad, and it just leads to tensions within the U.S. government. Pinckney's treaty is negotiated with Spain, and that's the one that allows us to use the port of New Orleans, which kind of goes back between the French and the British. And they're going to talk about how that we can go down the Mississippi and then go through New Orleans and be able to trade, which is important because basically if you're on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, you have to go down the Mississippi. Going back over the mountains is too big of a trip. It's just too hard. Let's see. Major battles in the American Revolution, Angela, I would say Saratoga and Yorktown. Saratoga is the one that we win in Upper New York that allows or compels or enables, or however you want to put it, the French to get involved. So we win at Saratoga. The French go, maybe they can do this after all. Let's join in. And then Yorktown is the one where Cornwallis surrenders and the world turns upside down. And that's basically the last major battle that we need to be. So kind of the beginning of the end, if you would. Alien and Sedition Acts. Yeah, Mahfouz. So the Alien and Sedition Acts, those are the ones that try to prevent newcomers from voting. And it says you may not criticize the government at all. So huge infringement on free speech. It's trying to limit the Democratic Republicans' power to criticize John Adams during the Quasi-War, who's a Federalist, because they keep printing nasty ththings in the newspaper. And he's all like, well, you can't say nasty things about me. Kind of has a thin skin. Yeah. So, yeah, it turns out the president can't just lock up people for printing things that he doesn't like about him. And then, thank you, Emma. I appreciate that. I never throw away my shot to make a Hamilton reference. So I try to do that as much as I can. But, some of you, I'm sure you just want more and more, and you'll never be satisfied. So trying. Yeah, the Alien Act, again, says that people can't vote for a certain number of years when they get to the United States. So the idea here is to prevent recently arrived immigrants, allegedly from France, who are coming here in droves to be able to vote for Democratic Republicans from attacking John Adams and the Federalist Party. Very unpopular. Gets repealed very soon afterwards. Let's see. What rebellion showed the government that the Articles of Confederation were weak? That was Shays' Rebellion. That's a rebellion of farmers up in Massachusetts. And then continuity and change in this period, says Tegist. That's a big one. Okay, so biggest change, the United States becomes its own country. Continuity, the United States forms its own country, but based on a lot of the same Enlightenment principles that they were ruling themselves under earlier, thanks to things like the House of Burgesses, New England town meetings, even the rights of Englishmen, right? A lot of those sort of things continue on. The United States, or the British North American colonists and eventually American citizens continue to take land from Native Americans. There's a bit of change for women, maybe with the Revolution, with Republican motherhood, but also they're still kind of oppressed. Same thing with slavery. Freedom up north, expansion of slavery down south. So you could make it an argument either way. Yeah, I think those would be a couple of good examples there. All right. Let's dive into a modified practice prompt. I've already shown this to the AP pass people. So this is just an example of a modified practice prompt that you could see. And then I have 2 or 3 documents that go with it. And then I want to show you an exemplar intro and body paragraph just to get a sense of like, how do I write this thing again, right? So the prompt is evaluate the extent to which political debates divided the United States from 1785 to 1800. So 1785, we're talking before the Constitution. You're welcome to include that, but it's not talking about the American Revolution, right, which ends in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. Goes all the way up to 1800. That would be the election of Thomas Jefferson, including that, but not talking about Jefferson's presidency, thus no War of 1812 kind of stuff. So what sort of documents might they give you with this? Well, they could give you a number of documents that you need to HIPP, right? Let's go over that real quick. Remember this. Some people use HAPPY, some people use HIPPO, same thing. Historical context, intended audience, point of view, and purpose. You need to know these things and be able to talk about them. But remember, it's always about value added. If you say, this is written by Thomas Jefferson and he's talking to Congress. Well, if it says that in the source material that they give you in the prompt, you're not getting any points for just saying that back. Or if you say, he's writing this to Americans. Well, that's helpful, and maybe it's true, but it doesn't tell you anything, which is why one of my personal recommendations is always, if you're doing HIPP, you only have to do one of the four. But realistically, if you're not doing H, you got to do all three: intended audience, purpose, and point of view. John Adams was writing to his fellow Federalists to convince them that they should support the Alien and Sedition Act because he needed to be protected as the commander-in-chief during a wartime emergency. Okay, well, now we're getting somewhere. Now you're actually adding something and showing that you know what you're talking about, right? And then outside evidence, you should be using as much outside evidence as possible, but remember, be cautious. If outside evidence is too closely connected to a document, it could be considered historical context instead of outside evidence. So try to think of ones beyond the documents as much as you possibly can. So what documents could they give you? Could be the Constitution. Just for sake of time, I'm going to leave these up here, and you can follow along on the slides once they get posted to Fiveable. But the U.S. Constitution includes, in this case, a 3/5 clause, as well as the fugitive slave clause that are involved there. And so this is all about slavery. So they want you to talk about how slavery divided the United States. Okay, I can do that. And then you might need to HIPP this at some point. Could you have an essay by Alexander Hamilton? Oh, absolutely. In fact, this is a Federalist paper, and he's talking about the Constitution and how he wants to adopt the Constitution. Okay, so they want you to talk about ratification debates of the Constitution. Again, each of the documents they give you is going to suggest a potential topic or genre or theme that they want you to talk about. In this case, political debates over slavery, the size of the government, should we ratify the Constitution or not? And then lastly, this one, the Kentucky Resolution, aka we're debating about the Alien and Sedition Acts and foreign policy, maybe states' rights, federalism, stuff like that. This is the Kentucky Resolution, or at least part of it. All right. So how might we use this? Well, let me give you a sample intro paragraph. This is a kind of I took it from some student responses that I got, added a couple things, tweaked it a little bit, and then I annotated it for you. You're going to start with contextualization, set the scene, right? And you want to ace this. You want to make sure that you are answer cite explaining this. In other words, drop some vocab, describe what the vocab is, tell me why I should care about the vocab and how it ties into the prompt. Then you want to have a complex thesis that includes a counterclaim, if you can, along with some subpoints. Let's see. From what you've learned in class, Mahfouz, before the outbreak, is that you shouldn't make the essay about the DBQ itself, documents itself. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, so what you've heard is not wrong, and I wouldn't necessarily contradict that. Anna, ACE is answer, cite, explain. It just means say a vocab word, define what the vocab word is, tell me why I should care. You can't just list a whole bunch of vocab. You have to actually use it in a good way. So Mahfouz, I don't think what they're saying here is don't let the documents drive your essay in the sense of like document 1 says, document 2 says, document 3 says, document 4. Like don't just list them. You should be able to talk about things beyond the documents. So you should treat this like an LEQ at least at first. But realistically, you have 45 minutes and you have to use 4 documents. Maybe I would say 5 just in case. It's going to have to be an integral part of this. So in my mind, as I'm reading each of these documents, I'm going to summarize them. And I'm also going to think what larger category that I should talk about. Can I fit this underneath? So use it as a help, but don't use it as I must write according to the thesis, my thesis according to the documents, or even following the documents in order. I would recommend not doing that. So what does that mean? Well, I'll show you an example of it actually in just a little bit. So here's my sample paragraph. My sample body paragraph looks a little bit like this. During the Revolutionary War, so we're starting just before the time period, the Articles of Confederation, there's my vocab, and here's the ACE part, helped to unite the disparate British North American colonies into a loose government for the purpose of defeating Great Britain and gaining their independence. So what did the Articles of Confederation do? They united into all the colonies into a government. After the U.S. gained their independence with the Treaty of Paris, the new states had to set aside their differences and work together to set up a new government and new nation, but divisions quickly emerged. So now I'm saying, okay, they're now a nation, but divisions. Now, notice the transition into the topic at hand, political divisions. Here's the counterclaim. Although Americans were united in their desire to sustain an independent republic, this means, were there some things that didn't divide Americans? Yeah. Everybody wanted to, well, for the most part, once the Loyalists left, everyone wanted to stay independent of Great Britain. And Angela was asking, like, for your thesis, could you formulate it as XA, where X is the counterclaim, rather than the usual XAB for 3 body paragraphs? Yeah, you could. Just the problem is you're probably going to want to have more than one body paragraph. So it just depends. So in this case, I'm using my 3 documents to make 3 body paragraphs. You could probably have, I would say, a minimum of 2 body paragraphs. 3, 4, 5 is fine. Oh, yeah. And yeah, your counterclaim should be a body paragraph too. So I guess in this thesis statement, I might have 4 body paragraphs. Yes. Your counterclaim should be a body paragraph. And then the only thing is that if you're making a counterclaim and then you're trying to refute your counterclaim, you probably want to have more evidence on the refute part, because that's part of your actual argument, right? So if you say Americans were united with this one thing, you should have 2 things that divided them. So that way you have 1 versus 2, and you're saying this is why it's my argument, because it just has more. Just kind of my thoughts on that, I suppose. So the rest of the thesis. Americans were united because they didn't want to become a British colony again. But what divided them? Sectional issues like slavery, and they were increasingly divided over time, right? Sectional issues like slavery, arguments about federalism and the size of the federal government, and over foreign policy items like European alliances. Could the counterclaim be part of the conclusion? Sure. You don't really have to have a conclusion. The only thing I would suggest for a conclusion is restating your thesis. Federalism and the size of the federal government. Yeah, Agatha, in terms of size, I'm talking about how strong the federal government should be. So should it be really, really strong, or should it be more leaving alone to the states, that kind of thing? So then what does a body paragraph look like? Well, let's take the first one, sectional issues over slavery. Here's an example. The newly United States were divided by sectional issues like slavery, with southern states embracing and expanding slavery and northern states stepping away from slavery. The southern states continued to fight for the protection of slavery, going so far as to include a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution of 1787. There's your citation. By the way, I don't recommend using the word document anywhere in your essay ever, not even doc. It wastes your time and it looks sloppy if you're just talking about in document 1, it says, just parentheses, number, move along. So that's using document 1. The United States also used 3/5 of enslaved Africans to boost the southern states' representation in Congress. Doc 1. We're using the document to talk about how slavery divides the United States. Now we need to HIPP it. These provisions were included so the southern states would join the constitutional union with the assurance that their property would be protected, something especially important after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. So we're talking historical context, maybe a little bit of purpose and point of view too. At the same time, and here's where you want to add some outside evidence, gradual emancipation was happening up north, ending slavery there over time and leading to more anti-slavery feelings that divided that section of the country from the South. So notice how we're using outside evidence of gradual emancipation in order to talk about how the North becomes even more different than the South. We're talking about political debates dividing the United States. So yes, this paragraph uses document 1. You don't have to use document 1 first. I just happen to choose that one for the purposes of this illustration here. It could be in body paragraph 2. Either way, keep it in the same order as your thesis subpoints, right? How do you properly source when you're describing it? Yeah, I would say source the cite the. Well, it depends on what you mean by source, I suppose. Sorry, do you mean sources in HIPP? How do you make sure the reader doesn't mix up outside evidence as historical context? Yeah, Reagan, great question. Okay, I see what you mean. Personally, I would actually, if I was this student, I would have added a 1 right here, because it's a good idea to put the document number after you think you've done something with the document, whether it be using or hipping. Put just the document number after every sentence. That way they know for sure. My suggestion, yeah, so you only have to use 1 part of HIPP for the 3 documents on the exam. That is true. What part of the HIPP was in the blue? Kind of hard to say, right? This person actually included the cotton gin, which is a little bit of historical context, but it was also talking about why they included the 3/5 compromise, which is a little bit of purpose or point of view of the Constitution. So they kind of combined a lot of them. No, Tegas, it's not all of them. You only have to use 1 part of HIPP, H or I or P. But again, as I suggested earlier in here, well, in any of these, you want to be using IPP together, because you want to make sure that your HIPP statement is value added. You want to make sure that you're actually saying something. If you just said, this is an essay by Alexander Hamilton, who was a Federalist. Well, that's not wrong, but I don't know why I should care about that. Why does that tell me more about political debates? The HIPP analysis has to connect back to the thesis and the topic we're talking about here, right? So this is just one example. I'll give you another one with period 4 in a little bit. Yeah, so I think the body paragraph kind of used like, it almost used HIPP, almost all of them altogether. You are required to HIPP not each document. No, you're required to HIPP 2. I would suggest you do 3, so that way you have a buffer just in case you do one of them incorrectly. It says in the rubric, you get 1 point for doing 1 HIPP. You get 2 points for doing 2 HIPPs. Do 3 and give yourself a bit of a buffer. All right, we're running out of time here. Oh, yeah, Tigist, that's in the old rubric, but let me double check that because I want to make sure that I'm quoting this correctly, and I'm still trying to get used to the new rubric myself. If we go all the way back to the rubric here, it is just 2, right? Yeah, HIPP 1 document, HIPP 2. Man, Tigist, you got me questioning myself on live. Ooh, it happens. It happens. Hey, but better safe than sorry, right? Yeah, it's just 2. All right, back to Unit 4 and getting some overview there. I know we're all like, well, I don't know what day it is. I haven't shaved or put on real pants in a long time. I'm in my sweats. Like, what's going on? And we watched too much Tiger King and we're all confused. So it happens. Let's go back to Unit 4 here. Unit 4 is going to be from 1800 to 1848. 1800, the election of Thomas Jefferson, all the way to 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. And so briefly, in 3 points, it's all about new democracy and new parties. It's about the economy changing and about migration and culture changing a whole lot too. So what does that mean? Yeah, I know. It's like there's a whole lot going on here. This is not just a deep dive here. So Jefferson and John Marshall are going to exist at the same time. Jefferson, remember, gets elected in 1800. He promises to clean up the government from John Adams, make it smaller, but turns out not too much. There's the road. He does the Louisiana Purchase, for example. The War of 1812 is something you should know, mostly for the road to it, like the Embargo Act, the Non-Intercourse Act, Macon's Bill No. 2, etc., as well as the aftermath, think Hartford Convention and the downfall of the Federalists, etc. And then allegedly the era of good feelings afterwards, although they were still arguing about slavery, right? Always, 1820 or so. John Marshall's going to preside over important Supreme Court cases like Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland. There's a whole bunch of important Supreme Court cases there, and they're going to involve John Marshall, a Federalist, flexing the Supreme Court's muscles, establishing judicial review. Somebody asked about judicial review earlier. Marbury v. Madison is John Marshall's decision that helps to establish the fact that the Supreme Court may strike down laws that are unconstitutional. There are other ones during this time period as well that suggest that they can strike down state government laws that are unconstitutional. McCulloch v. Maryland says that national laws are supreme over state laws. We're trying to figure this whole democracy thing out. So that's a little bit of change that's going on there. But don't forget, the North and the South are going to be very, very divided during this time because this is leading up to the Civil War, right? So what happens? Well, there's tariffs. The North tends to like tariffs more than the South because the South needs to import a bunch of stuff because they're just growing crops and cash crops. So they need to import a lot of stuff, whereas the North has a lot of industries that want to be protected by tariffs or taxes on imported goods. And yeah, I know this is definitely like a Henry Clay who's like, how you doing? Like Joey Tribbiani style, right? And Henry Clay, who is this guy, nice job that you recognized him at least, he likes tariffs. He likes the American system, which means internal improvements. He's going to be a leader of the Whig Party, as we'll see in a little bit. Remember that the Northeast and the Midwest begin to get connected, but the South does not. So the South becomes more and more backward in terms of technological improvements, in terms of infrastructure during this time period, and slavery. We're talking Missouri Compromise. We're talking slave rebellions like Nat Turner. We're talking about the Tariff of Abominations and things like that under Jackson. There's a whole bunch of sectionalism that happens during this time period. You should be aware of some of that. Speaking of Jackson, here's the famous acronym for Jackson, right? Which, and it kind of lays out some important things. Pure speculation, but a lot of teachers that I've been talking to are like, it's been a while since we've had an Andrew Jackson DBQ. So might be a good idea to brush up on some Andrew Jackson stuff. It's something that they ask you a lot about frequently on the exam, but they haven't had a DBQ on him for a while. It's worth brushing up there. So we got ourselves the War on the Bank. Remember, he hates banks. Indian removal, Trail of Tears, the Tariff of Abominations, which he supports mainly because he's a Union man. The common man. This is the time of universal white manhood suffrage when everyone can vote, even if they don't have land, as long as you're a free white man. So not everyone, okay, never mind. But if you're a white man, you can vote, and the property restrictions begin to go away. Participation in democracy goes up. And H, hired friends. The spoils system, the patronage system, looks a little bit like this, right? So the victor go the spoils. So you should be aware of Andrew Jackson. He's a big figure during this time period too. The second party system in general is a good idea to be aware of, and it looks really complicated and messy here. By the way, I highly recommend looking at this poster from David Walbert talking about the second party. Well, it talks about all of American history, at least until about 2010. Fantastic for political review and for political party reviews. If you want more on that, I actually did a question and answer session a couple of weeks ago on a Wednesday that was question and answer and political parties. Look it up on Fiveable. We did a deep dive into all the political parties. For now, during period 2, the big divide is going to be between the Whigs and the Democrats. Would someone be able to grab the link for that 501 and put it into the chat? So that would be the Q&A. Thank you, Tigist. You're the best. So Democrats and Whigs. Differences here. Democrats are the pro-Jackson party. Whigs are the pro-Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams type party. The Democrats tend to be more Southern, more agricultural, but they are all national parties. The Democrats tend to be more pro-slavery. Whigs tend to be more pro-Northern and more pro-manufacturing, more pro-American system, and more the people that do the antebellum reform movements and things like that. Most immigrants during this time, especially Catholics and Irish people, Catholics, Germans, Irish, tend to vote Democratic. So the Whigs tend to be a bit more xenophobic, a bit more nativist. You should be aware of those. If you want a deeper dive into that, see that live stream from a few weeks ago that Tigist is going to link into the chat. Then, huge deal during period 4, the market revolution and the antebellum reform movements that are very closely tied together. First of all, what do we have there? What are those two pictures? Anybody able to put that into the chat? What do we got at the top? What do we got at the bottom? What are those? They might be important. You might need to know those. Cotton and Telegraph. Cindy, nice job. Telegraph is at the top. A picture that I took this past October of a cotton field that I saw. I believe it was in Missouri. Right there. So, market revolution. It involves a whole bunch of transportation and communication inventions. The cotton gin is actually what this is going to start. So cotton is very close, Jameson. You're good. The cotton gin in 1793 kind of starts this, but then you're going to see the telegraph. You're going to see steam engines, canals, roads, steel plow, interchangeable parts, whole bunch of stuff happening. It just means people can communicate and trade a whole lot faster. People start to read newspapers because we can start printing them and sending them all over the place. Information and goods travel faster. Yeah, and Cindy does mention, ironically, the cotton gin is meant to reduce slavery. Yeah, talk about backfiring, right? Now, the king cotton, the idea of cotton being really, really profitable actually unites the whole country. Be aware of that, right? Southern cotton gets produced, but it goes up to northern looms in the textile mills. Be aware of like that kind of stuff. Lowell mill girls and things like that, who then make the slave cloth that clothes the slaves down south. Northern banks invest in slaves and slave insurance. So the United States is kind of tied together, even though the North pretends it doesn't like slavery. It's very much complicit in that whole thing. Immigration happens during this time. Again, we mentioned it's mostly Irish and Germans at this point. Catholics, they're mostly moving to the Northeast because that's where a lot of the manufacturing jobs are. Some of them do farming, but a lot of them aren't going to go south because they have slaves. Why do they need immigrant labor? It's going to lead to urbanization, women's roles. We talked about that. So let's talk about women's roles because we talked about urbanization. Immigrants come in, move to big cities. Cities start to grow, manufacturing hubs. Women, their roles begin to change because, again, a little bit of independence. Think Lowell Mills. And yet at the same time, there's that whole idea of the cult of domesticity. And so women should stay home and take care of the kids because they're very fragile. So go work in the mills for a few years until you get married and then stay home and take care of the kids. And then there's the Second Great Awakening and the antebellum reform movements. Like here, seen here, this is a burned over district revival. So the Second Great Awakening says, hey, we need more oomph in our religion. We need more of this heart. It's romanticism. It's related to the whole romantic movement. If you studied art or studied culture as a response to the heady Enlightenment, it's more heart-based. And it says, hey, you can be perfect. And if enough people are perfect, we can make society perfect. And that's where we get the antebellum reform movements. Tigist, you're the best. Thank you very much. That's the Q&A that has the deep dive on the political party system. see that in the chat if you'd like that. Go over a whole bunch of those. Thanks, Degas. Appreciate it. Antebellum reform movements. We have a variety of those, right? Those would be things like temperance, lessening alcohol. That would be abolitionism, getting rid of slavery, women's rights, Seneca Falls Convention, the Oneida Community Brook Farm Utopian Societies, Mormons, Transcendentalism, prison reform, mental health reform with Dorothea Dix, education with Horace Mann. We got a whole bunch of antebellum reform movements. That's its own stream right there. In fact, I think it was actually first semester. Go back and look at that if you want. But man, there's a lot of changes happening here. Whenever the economy changes a whole bunch, religion changes in response to it. And as religion changes, it tends to change society. So there you go. That was period 4 in a very short, like 12-minute nutshell. There we go. If you have other questions, feel free to put those in the chat. I'm going to move on just for sake of time into the practice problem and get you a sense of what that looks like. This actually one is going to be posted on AP Community, the community boards for Fiveable. So look it up there. I'll have a link at the end of here. I thought, we were gonna run out of time for this. So if you'd like to submit some and get some peer feedback, or give some peer feedback, or just peer feedback, or just read other people's responses, or practice responding to this, feel free. Here's what it looks like. Evaluate the extent to which economic changes impacted labor in the United States from 1800 to 1850. So how did the economy change, and how did that change labor? Peter's got the link again to the Fiveable community. Fantastic. Nice job. It might be actually under a different one. Let me check this real quick. Because, yeah, you need to go to this one. So add the 54 at the end of the URL. Because, Peter, I think the one you linked to has like the general discussion. The one that I'm linking to has the practice prompts. Doesn't really matter too much. You can find your way there. You folks know how to navigate. You know how to navigate websites, right? But yeah. All right, let's go back to what we need to, and that would be this. So how does labor change? So how does where people work, how they work, who's working? Slavery is a part of labor. Don't forget about that. So a couple of different sources. One of them is an advertisement from a South Carolina slave dealer. Interesting. Talk about slavery, please. And then document 2 is going to be letters from Lowell Mill Girl in 1844. Okay, so remember that. How would you use those? Well, let me show you a couple examples. Well, actually, if you want to do the practice ones, I'm just going to show the examples real quick. So if you are wanting to practice your own, maybe plug your ears, or don't look too quickly. Here's a possible intro paragraph. Again, notice the contextualization, the ACE, the counterclaim, and the 3 parts of my thesis, the claims that I'm making. That's a possible intro paragraph. Pause it during the replay later when you're doing the practice prompt if you want to. A possible body paragraph. This is the first body paragraph, and this is talking about how I could use document 1 to talk about slavery, the growth of the black belt, and things like that, slave owners and the internal slave trade that happens. That's how you could use it as a body paragraph. Now, keep in mind, you could also use one of these documents to talk about a counterclaim, where it remained heavily. So it talked about changes in those 3, like changes as it moved westward, changes include more women, changes transportation is easier, but something that stays the same is that it remains heavily dependent on and divided by slavery. So here we go. This is how you could use it to talk about how it stays equally divided as it had been. So in 1800, is the country divided by slavery? Yes. In 1850, is the country divided by slavery? Oh, yeah. That could be a continuity if you wanted to talk about it that way. So again, watch the replay and pause it at these points if you want to analyze these in more depth. But for the sake of allowing you to have some practice and for the sake of time too, I'm going to keep moving on. So the practice prompt for this one is available at that link. Feel free to click on that later. Mahfouz, you said you have a DBQ practice quiz tomorrow regarding the visions of Hamilton and Jefferson, writing about economic and political visions. Doesn't seem to be enough, does it? No. I think that'd be great. You have so much to talk about there. And that's why you don't have to force yourself into having like 4 categories or 3 or whatever. I mean, if you have a ton of economic stuff, which you do, whiskey tax, bank, all that stuff, awesome. Talk about that. Yeah, Jefferson and Hamilton are going to argue about politics. Sure. British versus French, strong central government versus states government, assumption of states' debts, whiskey tax, yes or no, but also economic. And there's a lot of overlap there. So a lot of stuff there. Reagan, I'm glad you found this helpful. We're a little bit over time, so we need to wrap things up. But any last minute burning questions that I can help you with from periods 3 and 4? Otherwise, again, we have those free question and answer sessions on Wednesdays that you can drop by and ask some questions there. And then Tuesdays, the cram sessions. Oh, man, those are the best. Stop by. Let's see. Angela was asking Northern banks underwriting slaves. Yeah, so Northern banks, and let me just make this a little bit bigger here. When it comes to Northern banks underwriting slavery, what that means is that Northern banks would literally sell slave insurance to Southern slave owners. So if your slave got hurt in the field or something like that, the Northern banks would be able to pay you back. It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to make it side by side again. That's okay. Yeah. So Northern banks would write slave insurance. They would, and also slaves are super expensive, right? Slaves cost as much as a luxury car does today, a prime field hand, right? So if you're buying a couple of slaves, you might need to finance that. You might need to take out a loan to be able to buy that. And so Northern states would help that as well. Agatha was asking, what's with the pirates? You're talking about the Barbary pirates, perhaps? Thomas Jefferson helps to send the American Navy over to the Barbary coast, aka Tunisia, think North Africa. And that's one of those cases where he's like, we need to have a small government, a small navy. Oh, wait, maybe we actually need one. And that's basically all you need to know for that. Yeah, Tripoli, exactly. The Tripolitan War near Tripoli off the coast of Tunisia. Fantastic. Are we close to having a civil war before the actual civil war? Yeah. Think about the Tariff of Abominations under Jackson when South Carolina threatens to secede then, right? And the tensions over slavery just continue to mount. We'll talk about that during the period 5 review, right? Absolutely. And then on a formula for the conclusion paragraph, I would say restate your thesis. That's about all I would do. Restate your thesis. You don't have a lot of time. You have 45 minutes. Let's be honest, you just don't have enough time to be able to write a whole bunch of extra stuff. So if your thesis drops off a cliff, that's fine. If your body paragraph drops off a cliff, that's fine too. If you have time, restate your thesis. Might not be bad. Okay, sweet. That's all the time we have for right now. Hopefully you folks learned something. We did okay. And let me just real quick go back to this because I like ending on this particular slide here. In the midst of all this craziness, I hope you folks are doing all right. And I know you can do it. We're here for you. Continue to watch these 5-able streams. Get your cram passes for some additional deep dives and some other fun things. Some practice prompts are available on the community. Bring your questions. We got you. You'll be great. Tegas is writing a whole bunch of resources there in the chat. Sounds good. All right. I hope you folks have a fantastic rest of your night. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.